When we left off last time, we were talking about how the technological revolutions have led us from an era in which print was king to one in which the various platforms and modes of communication have converged. So in part 3 of this module, we remain with chapter 1. Much of the content from this part of the lecture comes from there. You'll recognize this, the arc of the revolution from print to convergence. And as it's laid out in the book, we do move from one form of medium, print, to electronic forms of media, television, radio, to the digital era. And we are now at a moment in 2020 where we have convergence. And with convergence comes many interesting questions, and these are the kinds of questions that we'll ask throughout this course. How has convergence shaped audiences? How has it shaped the industry? How has it shaped the kinds of content, the formats of news, the ways that audiences are connected? So in this brief part of our first lecture, we'll think first about the print revolution. Now, oftentimes the print revolution is anchored in a historical moment in which the Gutenberg press was invented. But it really needs to be recognized that paper and block printing was developed in China many centuries before the invention of the printing press. In fact, it came about in the 15th century. But it's important to ask why the printing press would be so important, why it would usher in a new era, one that clearly demarcates one way of learning and communicating and thinking about one's place in the world to a new era. The Gutenberg press allowed for media to be created quickly, much more quickly than had been in the past. No longer are people having to handwrite documents and illustrate them in ways that took not only days but months and years to produce. The Gutenberg press instead allows people to share large amounts of information quite quickly, but it also democratizes access to this information. So if you think about some of those early manuscripts that were, handwritten by monks in monasteries, those were extremely expensive and really were only affordable to the wealthiest people. With the Gutenberg press, information can be printed out on paper, and that paper can be collated quickly and can be created in pretty cheap ways. And that means that people who previously could not afford things like books now have access to information that was out of their reach before. It also means that knowledge can be rapidly disseminated, that one doesn't have to wait for days or months or years for information to be copied over and shared, but instead it comes off the press quickly, it gets rapidly disseminated, that knowledge is rapidly dispersed throughout a populous area. So this gives rise in many ways to of course, religious revolutions. The Gutenberg press is often credited with creating the Protestant Revolution, but also it gives rise to nationalism and individualism. And these ways of thinking about the role of print within society are dealt with in depth in the book, and I'd like you to take a look at that and see how the authors of your textbook describe just the very important role that the printing press played in creating new societies. We move then to the electronic era. In the 1800s, the telegraph was widely used for commerce purposes, but quickly became a communications tool where people could connect with one another across um, broad swaths of land and do it quickly. The telegraph was in many ways, the precursor to the more mass medium of radio. So whereas the telegraph really was from one to one, radio becomes a medium of one to many. And this tradition of creating content that can be disseminated to masses introduces the era of mass communication. So with radio and with film in the 1800s and television in the 1900s, we see more and more not only mass media but mass audiences and mass produced content that's really meant to reach the largest possible audience with the lowest common denominator. The electronic era was really dependent on platforms that could broadcast signals, radio and television, or settings where audiences could come together, like movie theaters, and that disappears by the time we reach the digital era. Now you might ask, what makes something digital? We can think about images and texts and sounds and how they become converted or encoded into electronic signals. In previous eras, the analog era, those signals were dependent on finding their way often through wires or through antennas. But with the digital era, these signals are represented differently in varied combinations of binary numbers that become encoded as zeros and ones and then reassembled or decoded as quite precise reproductions. We see this happen with cable television, and then 1 or 2 decades later, the introduction of the internet revolutionizes really everything and brings forth new platforms for people not only to receive content like entertainment or news, but also to disseminate content. In many ways, the internet is a kind of great equalizer because we no longer have to wait for content to be produced in Hollywood or in New York or in studios, but rather it can be produced, as I am now, in someone's home and converted into these binary numbers and encoded and then decoded in ways that can be received by audiences wherever they are. So the internet ushers in a new era in which we communicate with one another through a platform, email. We entertain one another through new platforms like social media. And we will investigate the ways in which these digital media platforms disrupt traditional business models. Convergence. This is a concept that we'll come back to over and over again, and it's one that even 20 years ago would have been hard to imagine. Convergence is that merging of content across different media channels. So whereas we used to need to read a magazine article in a physical magazine that we would buy in a store and pay $2.50 for, or listen to a radio program through a receiver that had a dial on it, now all of these kinds of content, audio, visual, that we used to associate with different platforms, print, radio, are now available on the internet through these devices that stream them, laptops, tablets, smartphones. So no longer do we have to own a television set to watch a television show. No longer do we have to buy a record album in order to listen to a song. And the convergence of all of these media channels into one platform has meant that new business models have to be created that involve the consolidation of various media holdings. So when we gather together for Module 2, we'll talk about how media industries have restructured themselves in ways that can accommodate the convergence of these various media channels. So for example, one company would own elements of cable and phone and TV and internet access under one large corporate umbrella. This, of course, has been a challenge for media researchers like myself. You can imagine that when I'm talking to youth and I'm asking them about how much time they spend, for example, watching television or on social media, the ways in which we interact with content it's no longer very easy to discern. So we don't sit down at night and spend 30 minutes watching a television program. Instead, we may stream and binge watch an entire season of a television program over a weekend, and then go for 2 weeks and not watch anything. So what used to be a kind of habitual, ritualistic way of consuming media now has become much more integrated in our everyday lives. And so if I were to ask you how much time you spend on the internet for entertainment versus for education, you might find it very hard to say, well, I spent 20 minutes just goofing around, but 20 minutes listening to Dr. Jordan's lecture. So it's a challenge as we develop our understanding of the role of media in people's lives to really understand what it means to them, given that it's a relatively new phenomenon, the way that we consume media, but also it's a relatively unconscious one, and one that's difficult for people to parse out and be really self-reflexive about. So as we go forward, we're going to be thinking about all of these issues. I mentioned this in the first part of the module, that we'll think not only about the platforms themselves, television, internet, and the content, reality television, dramatic movies, news media, but also the modes of communication, audio, visual, print, and how this comes to us, whether it's with a handheld device, through a desktop computer. All of these considerations are important when we're considering the history of the media industry, but also the present moment where we're using media in new and unprecedented ways and really just starting to understand the implications and the effects of media as we go through these revolutionary stages. My guess is that when we come out of this pandemic situation and we think about how media has had to transform education and education has had to transform media, then we'll have yet another set of questions that we need to ask ourselves. So I'm really glad that I get to explore these with you in the context of this class, because I think they're really interesting questions and one that deserve our full attention. So we're at the end of Module 1, and there are a few things that I'd like you to take away over the process of these 3 lectures together. One is that media studies is a relatively modern academic field. And it's one that I'm really happy to be in because it's so rich and it's so relevant. It's also so rapidly changing. We saw that there really is not one definition of communication or even of media, partly because it's such a complex phenomenon, but also because it really demands of us that we be flexible in how we apply theories or what methods we employ when we're studying it or what we focus on. We saw in part 2 that there are these different models of communication that have different emphases, some that emphasize the sender or the producer of content, some that emphasize the receiver or how they interpret content, and others that focus on the medium as being really part of the message. Ultimately, when we consider media, we have to consider the rapidly changing technological landscape, one that changes not only in terms of its ability to reach us, but also our ability to connect with one another's. And as we're considering the changing technological landscape, we also have to understand the changes that happen within audiences. What are their contexts? What are their cultures? What are the historical moments that they're living through that create meaning for media in significant ways? So thank you for spending this time with me. I look forward to being with you again next week, and I will go ahead and post these. Make sure that you go to the discussion thread where you can ask me anything. See you next time.